Welcome, everyone. My name is Nikki Wu, and I'm a freshman studying Global Liberal Studies at New York University's Washington, D.C. Global Academic Center. I'm excited to introduce you all to today's event, Is AI the Key to Fighting Fake News? The dissemination of fake news on social media platforms is a troubling and destructive trend with dire implications for the election and reducing COVID-19 cases. That's why everyone from large tech companies to colleges and universities are stepping up to create solutions that combat fake news. A recent study from NYU Tandon and Abu Dhabi Research Institute researchers revealed that pairing headlines with credibility alerts from fact checkers, the public, news media, and even artificial intelligence can reduce people's intention to share misinformation. Thank you for joining us for a conversation on how new AI tools could help social media networks and news organizations weed out fake news. It's my pleasure to welcome our guest speakers for today, including Hoda Al-Kazemi, a research assistant professor at NYU Abu Dhabi, Sadat Garg, the Institute Associate Professor of ECE at NYU Tandon, Rachel Greenstadt, an Associate Professor at NYU Tandon, Nasir Maman, the Vice Dean for Academics and Student Affairs at NYU Tandon, Christina Pepper, Assistant Professor of Computer Science at NYU Abu Dhabi, and lastly, our moderator for today, Stephen Rosenbaum, Executive Director of NYC Media Lab, as well as New York City's first entrepreneur at large for NYC EDC. Steve has started 5 companies, all in the video platform and digital storytelling space. He has 2 video patents in video technology and has written 2 books, Curation Nation and Curate This. He has also presented 2 TED Talks, holds 2 Emmy Awards, and was honored with the Science Journalism Laureates at Purdue University. Please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions, which will be addressed towards the end of the program. Thank you all again for attending, and I'd now like to hand it off to Stephen Rosenbaum to begin the discussion.
Nikki, thank you so much. And thank you, as we're in the midst of finals during this week, to spend time with us. I have to say, when I was asked to moderate this conversation, my first reaction was, well, this won't be hard. The people are really smart, and I'll just kind of like move the conversation. And then as I spent some time thinking about where we are in the world and where AI is in the world and where fake news is in the world, I realized that not only is it going to be challenging, but we might, for all of the intellectual firepower we have around the table, we might not solve it today, which would be terrible. That being said, I thought I would just ask each of you to do a brief introduction, less about your background, though that's certainly interesting to our audience, but more about what you're working on now. And we'll just go down the list and then we'll begin a conversation. So Nasser, if you would begin.
Oh, sure. Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I hope this will be a fun conversation. So I'm Nasser Mamin, and I've kind of been working on media forensics related issues for more than 2 decades, or almost 2 decades now. Kind of looking at, is there a picture real, or tampered, or fake, and these days that whole thing has expanded now into disinformation, right? Previously, it was simply evidence in a court of law. Is it a real image or not, right? But today, it's something much broader, and it's not just text, video. It's images, video, text. It's become a much more difficult problem, and I've been looking at some of the problems in that space.
Thank you. Rachel, would you go next?
Sure. So yeah, I'm Rachel Greenstadt, and I am a privacy and security researcher who's also studied kind of how privacy and security interact with machine learning algorithms. But I've also been very interested recently on sort of how Wikipedia moderation works, especially for people who want to interact with Wikipedia privately, and understanding how people manipulate Instagram in order to sort of falsely promote content to sort of go viral when it wouldn't otherwise do so, and also studying kind of the ways in which sort of communities promote sort of not antisocial behavior online, whether it's like intimate partner surveillance and other types of things, and things of this nature. So that's sort of some of the stuff I'm working on.
Excellent.
Oh, and YouTube conspiracy theories. That's another stuff.
No shortage of those. All right.
Yes.
Siddharth, would you go next?
Yes, hi. My name is Sadat Garg. My work is primarily in the last couple of years, been focused in the area of trustworthy machine learning. So we're trying to figure out trust issues, and perhaps some of these will come up in this conversation, but we're trying to figure out how, if at all, it's possible to deploy machine learning and AI tools in a way that can be trusted by the users, both in terms of security vulnerabilities, the robustness of the tools, and also how do we make sure that these tools are fair and, for example, unbiased against certain demographic groups. And most recently, I think some of the work most relevant to this conversation is a deep forensic analysis of deepfakes, essentially tools that are used to generate fake images. And we have some interesting unpublished work in that area that I might be able to talk about.
Excellent. Next, Hoda.
Hello, everyone. I would say good evening for whoever is turning off their working hours today in Abu Dhabi, and good morning for everybody else in New York. I work primarily in cryptographic research in the past few years. So we work on design analysis of cryptographic primitives primarily, but and we also did a few bits of research around machine learning and effective machine learning on improving cryptographic designs, especially the designs relevant to integrity checkers, which I think is going to be relevant to this conversation. It's going to be hopefully a very interesting collaborative conversation in the next 90 minutes. So looking forward.
And then last but not least, Christina.
Yes, hi, thank you. My name is Christina Pepper. Also, good morning or good evening from my side to everyone listening. My major focus in research has been on topics like network security, GPS spoofing, infrastructure security, and mobile network security, so cellular network, mobile phones, and so on. What is maybe a bit more relevant to this conversation here is a rather recent thread of my research, which focuses on deletion, on digital forgetting of how data is handled and managed online, how people can try to control what is there, how they can remove traces. Well, for example, when we talk about deletion on messengers, if they actually do what they're supposed to do, what people want, and how they, in general, people can control that. And I'm looking forward to the discussion of this panel today. Thanks.
Excellent. So here's the challenge of this conversation. We have 208 people joining us. So here's what we know. We know people are absolutely interested in this. I mean, that's for a discussion on a Monday morning in a rainy New York, to have 208 people dial their browsers over to us is a good thing. But I want to just start with a little bit of level setting, because the one thing I know about these kinds of open conversations is there's some very, very smart PhD people listening who understand all of the definitions. Then there's other people who are coming in that are really kind of beginners. So let's just begin with a definition. So we're here to talk about artificial intelligence, but often it's a phrase that gets used interchangeably, and I would say maybe occasionally sloppily, with machine learning or deep learning. So let's just start by defining. Let's draw the line. Is artificial intelligence higher up the food chain than those other mechanisms? And I'll just say for novices, when we think of Hal in 2001 and he won't open the pod bay doors, because I think of the whole world in terms of science fiction, would Hal be artificial intelligence as opposed to machine learning? Don't feel the need to answer the question with my silly description, but like, let's just make sure we know what artificial intelligence is for the purposes of this next 45 minutes. Oh, come on, that should be easy.
I would suggest that it might be easiest to focus on the use of algorithms, right? More generally, I think algorithms, whether they're rule-based algorithms, which are typical of the old ways of doing AI, or data-driven algorithms, are increasingly being used in fighting against fake news, and also to generate fake news, fake content, right? So I would say as long as there's an algorithm involved, as long as there's computer code and not human beings kind of looking at fake news or generating fake news, I think that's relevant to me at least.
Yeah, I kind of agree there, right? Artificial intelligence is actually a brilliant marketing term. That's all it is. Underneath it is algorithms and models, right? Certain types of models and certain types of algorithms for certain applications. And that's essentially what it is at its core, right? But we like the word artificial intelligence. It sounds very sexy.
I just want to point out that in the first 3 minutes of this conversation, we've already taken the thesis, which does AI fight fake news, and disassembled that thesis. So we're off to a good start.
Yeah, I think there's two types of algorithms that are like really of interest here. One is the sort of the algorithms that are used by platforms to sort of decide what gets amplified. And then there are sort of decision support algorithms, which I wouldn't necessarily argue are done instead of humans, but to sort of aid humans and scale humans at being able to do the kind of work that humans might do. And that's where the artificial intelligence kind of comes in that sense of, it's like, can you take a task that you used to have a bunch of humans do and scale it in that way? And that's, I think.
All right, so as long as we're in the definitional part of this conversation, let's just get right into this word fake. Are there things, so in order for something to be fake, does it have to have a fact that is purposefully misstated as opposed to an opinion? And I'm thinking about all the things Twitter is doing where it's labeling political statements as in question, which is very different than fake. Like, are there things that you guys could describe as fake without debate, that when you see that, you know it's fake, and other things where it's gray area?
I think in the domain of images, that's relatively easy to do, right? Because, either an image captures, I mean, actually even that perhaps is mildly under question, but either an image captures a physical representation of an environment in a certain moment of time, or a video for that matter, or it doesn't. And so I think, in the context of images and videos and deepfake images and deepfake videos, I think that's a lot easier to answer. I think for, fake news, fake opinion, I don't know if definitionally we're going to come to a conclusion, but perhaps other people have thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I mean, Sadat is more or less right, but it gets a little bit subtle, right? So what are you looking at me right now, right? Look at that little tile, that's fake. I'm not sitting in, there's no Washington Square arch, whatever behind me, right? That's fake.
That's fake too.
But every camera, I mean, modern cameras have so much machine learning and other algorithms going on inside that the Pixel camera, I was talking to the person who modeled that, designed that Pixel 4, basically was telling me that they take 7 pictures, right? And then combine them to get the final picture. So the final image that you see is really not, it's been synthesized in some sense. Now, of course, now are these manipulations or whatever you call them, generation, etc., is that, does it truly still represent the content? What the scene was? Mostly yes, but it's starting to get subtle that even our image and video capturing technology is becoming so complicated that you can't say that this was actually the way it was.
I mean, Instagram has all kinds of filters to make things.
Those are explicit filters that users put, right? This is even before, in the camera itself, before it even comes out to you. Right?
So would an algorithm then label all those images fake, since they're not, because they're altered?
Then we're trivializing the whole thing. Probably not. So yeah.
But understand, we're already at a sticking point and early in the conversation, because somebody who's writing that algorithm has to say, I'm okay with a camera making you more beautiful, your skin smoother, the sky more rich. That we don't consider that misleading. But if I put 2 people in a frame together that were not in that frame together and claim that they were in the room at the same time, that's fake. Well, that makes the idea of an algorithm being kind of objective already a wishful but probably unreachable goal, right?
Right. I mean, I think, if you think about videos or photographs. They were meant to be perhaps the closest you can get to first-hand evidence of, other than actually having been at the scene yourself, right? Subsequent to that, like someone is telling you about what happened, which then gets into the realm of descriptions of events and activities and so on, right? And so if we can't even pin down what it means for something to be fake in the image and video domain, it's going to be even more challenging for content, for non.
So Hoda, does it really just come down to attribution and authentication? Is that what your work leads you to believe?
I think truly it's more than that, because maybe attribution and authentication is a key piece where you want to know the origin of the messaging that's being sent and circulated around, and it definitely will cut down on specific dissemination tactics, but still it's not going to be the silver bullet that will solve everything. So when you have a piece of misinformation, I think this is the final verdict that we reach to. It might not be fake, but it might be misinformation in one regard or another. It might be accepted if it's in certain norms, if it's just about filtering a specific truth or not. But I think in the field of media, understanding the origin of the message plays a huge part in authenticating where did this message come from. And maybe this is why all of these great initiatives that we see around fact-checking and about the fact that you need to authenticate a piece of news, and when you bring, for example, cryptography to the table, it's not a very welcomed conversation everywhere, because you started building the solution with fact checkers before you encrypted. You provided, for example, an end-to-end encryption, or what we call hash trees to authenticate the messages. And now when you want to apply it into the system, it defeats the purpose of understanding the origin of the message. So it's not always a silver bullet to use cryptography in the mix, but we still have work here to do.
So yeah. Is lying the same as deception? I mean, I'll give you an example. I don't play poker, but if I did, in my fantasy world, I would bluff brilliantly. Well, does an AI look at a bluff and say, that's a lie? He's saying he has a certain kind of hand, but that's not true. And I guess what I'm trying to get to is, does it come down to the underlying purpose of deception? If it's meant to be misinformation and it's meant to confuse people and it's meant to be viral and dishonest, does an AI behave differently than if it's, for example, humor? I read The Onion, which is just filled with what an algorithm might think of as lies, but I find it funny. So
AI doesn't do anything, right? It does what we design it to do, in the sense the way you're posing the question as if it's some independent entity.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So,
but all right. So this jumps ahead a little bit then. But then if there's an AI at Facebook and an AI at Twitter and an AI at Google and an AI somewhere else, and they all behave differently, then does the same piece of information get tagged differently because it's designed, it's written by the developer and the developers, and they bring their politics and their biases into the mix? Doesn't it need to be something that's agreed upon broadly and not on a per platform basis?
I don't know, because of the way we humans look at and kind of sometimes make a judgment whether somebody is being deceptive or not. We probably have, evolution has kind of trained us in some way, to train the neural networks inside our head, I guess, to be able to pick up cues of deception, right? Your body language, because when you lie, there is an extra cognitive load involved, right? Lying is not straightforward. Your brain needs to work a little bit harder when you lie. But at the same time, as humans, we are very habitual liars. We say about, I forget the number, 16 lies a day, apparently, on an average. But these are kind of small lies, right? When it comes to poker, etc., where the stakes are large, probably there's a big cognitive load. And when you're playing poker, you have some way of making that judgment. I'm playing poker, I have some way of making that judgment, right? So different algorithms will have different kind of training and different models that will allow them to arrive at that judgment. it's not God's truth, right? It's not a deterministic answer. It's simply a judgment that based on my past experience, it looks like this could be a deceptive action. That's all an algorithm can do, right? That's what AI can do, right? At the end of the day, it's an algorithm. So expecting all algorithms that have been trained differently to work the same way probably doesn't make sense, right? They will all work a bit differently.
And so, different platforms could have, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm saying different platforms could have different intents, right? We're already seeing differentiation in that space where, some platforms are actually marketing themselves as being more or less permissive as it relates to, allowing fake content. And I think users will decide based on their own preferences and sometimes political preferences, what sorts of platforms they want to engage in. We see this with Reddit and Twitter, right? Completely different kind of approaches to, completely different audiences in some sense on same topic, and very, very different discussions on Reddit versus Twitter.
Let's not go past that too quickly. What do you mean different in what way?
So, I mean, politically, I think the political leanings of people who discuss topics on Reddit and Twitter can be quite different, right? So if you look at, BLM, for example, the conversations that were most viewed on Twitter were kind of different from the conversations that were being had on Reddit or 4chan, for example, right? 4chan being almost like an extreme version of that. And we're seeing that with I guess there's a new platform, not Signal, I'm sorry. There's a new, I forget the name, right?
Gab or Parler.
Yeah, Parler, for example, right? Which is explicitly designed with a political intent. So I think we'll see more differentiation of that nature, which is unfortunate because it just means that there's not one reality anymore, but there's two divorced realities, right? Perhaps both shorn from the actual underlying evidence.
Yeah, I think that there's in these different communities, there's two things that affect it much more. I mean, the algorithms are sort of follow, but like it's sort of the community kind of moderation standards of what the community wants and the incentives and the kind of incentives that in terms of most of all these things are curated, right? So there are algorithms that decide like what gets and that may just be a matter of aggregating votes, but it may also be machine learning, but like what gets promoted. And it's that interaction between sort of the audience and the nature of kind of what's incentivized that result in these dynamics, I think, much more than sort of programmed rules.
So one of the things that I think, I mean, it's funny in some ways, the audience is expecting, the five of you to be able to steer us toward this safer, cleaner, more logical future. But in fact, if you look at, for example, Facebook, I mean, we know that fake information is more salacious. It gets shared 6 or 7 times more than factual information. And since you're not paying for Facebook, Tristan Harris famously said in The Social Dilemma, it's kind of a truism, if you're not paying, you're the product. And he describes the social networks as cancer. I mean, he's quite concerned about, so I guess my question is, if the people that are disseminating this information and blurring the line between fake and accurate have a financial interest in continuing to do that, then does all of our effort to build technology kind of fall on deaf ears?
Well, I mean, somebody's making money off of it, right? It is illustrative, I think, to look at the differences between Wikipedia and something like Facebook, where the values are different and the incentives are very different, right?
No, keep going with that, because that's important.
Just that. So look, like, I mean, Wikipedia made a something of a choice around 2007 to add friction to their platform, to make it much, and they reduced participation as a result. You can see this in terms of people call it the decline of Wikipedia, right? But obviously Wikipedia is still around and it's very successful, and it is largely credible in a way that nobody, when it was created, really thought it would have that kind of credibility. But you know, can you imagine, it's hard to imagine some of these larger commercial platforms making choices that would reduce engagement, reduce monetization potential, and sort of reduce the shareability and things of that nature in order to increase the underlying credibility. And I think that those incentives matter. And I think those illustrations show that, like, you know, it's not something inherent to having sort of user-driven content and community moderation and all of these types of things that leads to these dynamics of sort of fake and lack of credibility, but it is choices, and it is the ways in which these things are structured and the incentives.
All right, so now, sir, if we could, let's dig into deep fakes for a moment. So no one who's watching this webinar would ever be confused about whether or not you're sitting in Washington Square. I mean, clearly your picture is a different color temperature. It's got a kind of a crisp line around it. But what we know as technologists is, you know, it is inevitable that you will be able, in, you tell me, a year, 2 years, certainly 3, to be able to create images in which you are places that will be indistinguishable from facts. Does the inevitability of deepfakes kind of up the ante for all of us about what is fake and what is real?
I think so, right? And I've been saying this for almost 2 years now. The problem with deepfakes is the fact that seeing is believing is under attack, right? The fact that we cannot believe what we see. I mean, Black Lives Matters would not have happened if some folks did not capture what the horrendous acts that were committed on video and share them with the world, right? And we believed them, right? Because we don't have the technology that can make that stuff up right now. We can get. There are so many other, the image of a young Chinese man standing in front of the tank, daring it to go ahead, right? It kind of moved us. Images from the concentration camps, they moved us, right? So now, if suddenly you see an image and whatever, there's someone who's the perpetrator inside being captured, like doing something wrong, could just claim it's fake. Or people looking at it may look at it and say, maybe that's true, I don't know, maybe it's a fake. And that's bad for society, right? So what do we need then? We need to bring back authenticity, integrity to media, right? Some media. There's no need to have authenticity to this particular recording. I mean, if someone takes it and puts a earring on my ear, no big deal, right? What the heck, doesn't change things. But there's certain things that we want to be able to authenticate, right? Body cameras in law enforcement, cameras of journalists, right? And things of that sort. And the technology is there. It can be done potentially up to a point, right? It's not going to be perfect, but it can be done up to a point. And perhaps we need some mechanisms like that can do that. We need mechanisms to detect, and detection is always difficult. Detection is always a cat and mouse game. But nevertheless, you can keep the riffraff out of the picture. You can at least detect the people who are not very good at it, right? You can at least get that. And then also one needs education, right? That one needs some way of educating people not to jump to conclusions when they say a picture or video, like be more discerning about this, and like the work that was mentioned earlier, what we did, the warning labels saying, hey, this could be fake and things of that sort. So user awareness, and then perhaps it needs some policies, some laws, something of that sort. I don't know. It's always dangerous to go down that road, but perhaps something is needed in a light-handed way to curtail this a bit.
So there's an app on the Apple Store called Face Swap, which I have not yet used, but I've watched the promo enough to think that it's probably pretty effective.
Right. So I think 3 years later, I don't have to be here. My grad student will give the talk as if it's me, and so who knows?
But what's interesting about this, and I thought about it when we were looking at the guests today, is there's, you know, unless I misread all of your backgrounds, in which case you can slap my hand, there's not a sociologist among us. Like these questions they're technical on one hand, but they're also anthropological, and so you know, if seeing is believing has been the coin of the realm almost since images began, and we're about to be at the end of that moment in time. That's a big, complicated question. And by the way, among people that want to answer it simply, people come back to, well, we just need, we need to teach visual social media literacy. Students need to understand to not trust what they see, or they need to be able to be, quizzical about the source. I'm a little bit cynical about that because, I don't know about all of you guys. I mean, I get 30 LinkedIn invitations a day, and I would say 29 of them I think are fake. And it takes real effort to look at the name and see who they know and look at like there's no push button way to stop the amount of fake information that's coming at me, and it's going to get worse. So let's get to optimism for a second. Have any of you seen either technologies or policies or practices that made you go, oh yeah, that's it. That's the beginnings of a solution over there? Either one of your peers' work or work that you're doing that feels optimistic?
Yeah. So maybe I can draw an analogy here, which is I was thinking about, this problem of detecting fake news and deep fakes. Firstly, I agree with Nasir that, ultimately we'll need to, at least methods to authenticate images and videos. At least those from body cams and so on are going to be critical. But, think about, spam detection. I think we would all agree that our spam filters work reasonably. And they work reasonably because the companies that provide us these services have financial incentive in making our spam filters work well. And spam, actually, there's a massive financial incentive to the attacker. The problems are quite similar. The intent of the attacker is to evade, either rule-based or machine learning-based spam detectors. And in that setting, I would say that with massive investments, technology companies have been winning the game, but they have great incentive in winning that game, right? And I think the issue with fake news, as we kind of elucidated up front, is it's really unclear to me that many of the social media platforms have any incentive to win this battle. So I do think with both humans assisted with incredible resource investment that involves armies of essentially human developers, assisted with perhaps some AI technology or some technology support, it's not an unwinnable battle. But I worry that the incentives don't align essentially.
So let's go further there just for a second though, because the other thing, AI is also going to create and distribute fake news.
I think there's also kind of an emerging body of work in AI trying to generate language, for example, right? So there are these complex language models where you can have, you give it a prompt and it tries to generate essentially fake information. And I think all of that is going to be the case. And so so in some sense you would expect to see AI and bots, armies of human bots or trolls, essentially fighting on the other side with hopefully armies of well-resourced engineers who are out to, and I don't know where we'll land up, but all I'm saying is, there appears to be the reason for optimism is there appears to be significant financial incentives for exactly the same technologies to spam all our inboxes, and they haven't been able to. And to me, that gives me some reason to hope that with resources and aligned incentives, we can get there. But again, to me, the question is incentives.
Christina, you look a little troubled.
No, I'm not troubled at all. Let me make 2 points here. I think the first one is when we started talking about algorithms, there's often a promise with algorithms that things may be more objective than they are when humans take decisions. And in some way that's right. Algorithms can in some way be more objective than humans. But on the other hand, they may not be as objective as we think. And there's also bias that can be introduced by machine learning algorithms themselves. And that's something that often we may not be aware of. Sometimes we are, but this exists. So it all in some way boils down to the matter of also trust for me. So how much do we actually trust the information, the sources that we see? I know that you described being bombarded with news on these social media platforms. I would hope that over time, I mean, this is not something we can solve in the way of working on the algorithms, because that's intentionally made to make people interact more, to share more, to bind people also to those platforms. So it follows exactly the incentives that Dieter was talking about now. But over time, I think there's the matter of trust, and do we trust about the sources, trust where the information comes from, and are we then as humans able to kind of take certain decisions and understand what we can trust and what not. That's the first point. And if you allow me, I would like to make a short second point, which is,
Of course,
there are, we are talking about AI in the realm of fake news, and AI is actually used, or machine learning is used for two aspects. And I just want to make that point very clear. It can be used for two aspects. First thing is, it can be used for actually creating or disseminating or increasing the fake news. So actually feeding more of the news into the system. And in some cases, it may be very clear fake news. In some cases, it's way more subtle. It's about influencing people. So can be used for that. On the other hand, as also the talk title indicates, AI is something where it can give some promise, and Nazar can talk more about that it can actually be used to identify those fake news. So it's actually two sides where we use the same core techniques in some way, or that not we, but where the platforms are using AI to create content basically that is shared further. And we have some hope that we use similar machine learning techniques to actually identify these fake news and possibly warn users. And that's a very interesting aspect, using the same technologies for both sides.
So it's interesting. We've tiptoed around the word platform a bunch. So let's drill down there for a second. So there are obviously engineers at Facebook that are working on this problem. There are engineers at Twitter working on this problem. There are engineers, at Reddit theoretically working on this problem. But in terms of their boss's boss's boss, what they're getting measured on is engagement. And engagement means, what are the things I can show you that you will watch and click and share? And those two internal battles are not technological, right? They're business issues. But I can only imagine if you could shut off salacious information on Facebook, their traffic would drop overnight by, make up a number, 30%, 40%. I mean, I like pictures of my friends, children, and kittens and vacations. But I'm guilty of being sucked into watching images and stories that are salacious. I'm guilty of that. And I know it's bad. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, A, we have to build the technology, and we have to understand that the definitions of fake versus, misleading are critical. But we then also need to get the people that distribute this information to want to collectively kind of declare a truce and dial down the distribution of this information. And that, I think, may be harder than the technology.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think one of the key issues that we're dealing with here is how to build a holistic technical buy-in. So because you want people who are buying into building this technology to build a holistic solution. You asked a while ago what kind of algorithms and tools do exist for us to fight this. And they are existing in silos and in patches, and they solve one problem but not the other, or they're being there because they have historically solved spam problem, for example, and now we can use it with fake news. But the issue is how can you build a holistic solution where you address from the get-go, before you even start developing an AI-based technology piece or code or algorithm, the algorithmic biases that exist within this AI, because you need to eliminate that, because that, as Christina said, might accelerate the problem for you, the trustability problem. And how can you incentivize user? For example, you talked about engagement right now, and they would love to be engaged into a platform. But as a user, I would like to also be engaged in a trusted platform. So maybe adding trustability to this equation would attract traffic to the platform, because it would attract people to come into the platform and be part of this trusted dialogue. And we saw on Twitter, for example, there is this way of authenticating accounts. And once you authenticate this account, it's deemed trusted, that it's a reference of a specific person. Why don't we also, in this day and era, have a trustability index on these social media platforms.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is going to be aligned to different conversation, and that kind of trustability index would direct where do you go in the conversation. We saw a few solutions in the election, in the phase when the US election was happening. Twitter would when you forward a piece of information, for example, it would just stop you there if there is if it's a piece of information with a high index on a fact checker of being false, it would just warn the user and then tell them to go to certain platforms to seek, for example, the truth behind specific pieces.
Yes. I want to push back a little bit on one of the things that you said. I think I agree with a lot of it. The trusted, the content and being able to sort of develop trust in content and is something that is useful, but I don't necessarily agree that like more authentication and attribution of the actual speakers necessarily helps. I mean, Facebook has huge problems with this, and they have a real name policy. A lot of misinformation is spread by blue check marks on Twitter. And versus again in Wikipedia, where people have to have accounts, but those accounts don't need to necessarily be tied to real life identities in any real way. I think we are used to thinking that people, that sources are connected to trust, and that's a way of thinking about it when those sources have a reputation for credibility. But it's that reputation for credibility rather than sort of ties to real world identities that is important. And I do think it, being able to sort of speak privately is also very useful online in certain contexts and can often lead to more truth.
100%. When I mentioned the trustability index, I didn't want to connect it to a user or a region. The trustability index will be based on the content itself. So the more you share trusted content, the higher your profile index on trustability of disseminating trusted information. So it would be on the content rather than the origin of the user. And I do agree with you. Facebook itself, I think they deleted over 2 billion accounts quarterly in 2019, deeming them fake. I mean, yeah, we know origins are not the.
So can I inject a note? I'm sorry, Stephen.
Go ahead. And then I have a little optimistic tag.
I was going to inject a note of pessimism, unfortunately. To follow up on what Rachel said, right? Just a couple quick points, right? We can authenticate the source of information, but what if the sources are not trusted themselves? One, and secondly, we see this with WhatsApp, right? Which is, everyone has a reasonably it's kind of tied to their real world identities. But in India, WhatsApp is this massive source of fake news, probably the largest fake news source, social media platform in India, at the very least, world's largest democracy, right? Completely grappling with this issue. The other quick comment I'll make is, you were saying that there aren't computational or social scientists here, but what a social scientist would be able to tell you is that if you imagine a world where news is decentralized and your algorithm as an individual is that anybody, the enemy of my friend is my enemy, then essentially one can show that the world splits up into essentially these bipolar entities, right? Where everybody in one kind of universe trusts everybody else in that universe, and then everybody else in this other universe trusts everybody else, right? And so as long as there's no central source, trustworthy source, which currently doesn't seem to be the case, I think we are doomed to live in these like two separate realities. And so I think what we have to do is to work towards at least centralizing, it sounds horrible, right? But centralizing trust in, as Wikipedia does perhaps, right? I mean, in some sense, Wikipedia is, no, but Rachel is gonna, correct me, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, like Wikipedia doesn't the whole point of Wikipedia is that there is no centralized authority of truth and trust, right? Like the Wikimedia Foundation doesn't make editorial decisions, the community does. And
agreed, but I don't get to see the way the sausage is made, right? What I get to see as a reader of Wikipedia, in some sense, the vast number of people just see that one article.
Right.
But
you can look it up. You can look up the revision history. You can look up the talk pages. You can change all this. It's all the sausage is all there, which is one of the things that is that actually I think has allowed it to be successful in that way.
But I mean,
and it's got problems. I'm not gonna claim.
Right. So I'll just throw in a plug here. You may or may you know this, but Wikipedia's 20th birthday is coming up on January 15th. And the Media Lab is doing an hour-long conversation with the CEO of Wikipedia. So join us there and we can dig into Wikipedia for an hour. All right, we have 25 questions that have stacked up. We have 14 minutes remaining. So I'm just gonna jump into these. And so this is from Sarah Frey, and she says, are you working on social media literacy for young students? A teacher of the year from Alaska was on NPR last month. She teaches her high school students. She said that they seem to pause before sharing after receiving such education.
We should. I commend that teacher, and we should do more. I regret to say that I've not done so far anything, but I will. I think we all should. It's a very important thing. So I've done a lot for educating young kids in cybersecurity. I think the next thing for us to do is disinformation as well. Yeah.
All right, next question is from Debbie. I'm going to mispronounce her last name, Surdzi. With our country so divided and their belief system, what facts, if someone found the key to come up with a trusted program to help both sides come together with similar goals? It would have to be a proven program. Are we close to some kind of AI? Sorry, it's a little bit of a confusing question, but she's essentially saying, can AI bring together different points of view to have conversations?
I don't know about AI, but maybe there's some way to pose the questions. I've read some research that suggests that a lot of people are less far away on sort of the facts than sort of seems. It depends kind of how things are posed, because sort of if you ask people certain questions and they're not sort of politicized in certain ways, but they're asked more like, do you know this thing? People can answer them correctly. And yet, so I think there's sort of some performative fakeness that happens there. So maybe there's some opportunities to think through things that way. It's not very well developed.
No, I agree. And in fact, the opposite is happening. AI techniques are being used in order to kind of infect people, if that's the right word, right? They attract them to a particular channel on YouTube, and then giving content X, and then suddenly they kind of corrupt them with content Y, right? And so.
Yeah, I would even add, I don't see AI as, I don't see AI definitely as the panacea here. If anything, I think there is a need for more ethical development of AI, right? And I think, we have to be very, very careful. My entire research agenda revolves around the idea that
yeah, what I meant was the recommender algorithms, right?
Yeah, no. I wasn't pushing back on what you were saying.
Somehow target recommendations at them that tend to make them look at the opposite viewpoint as well, in some sense, and perhaps get them to see a bit more, open their eyes a bit. Not claiming one is right or one is wrong, right? But simply give them a wider exposure. Perhaps that can be done, right?
No, I agree. I don't see the financial incentive for any platform to do that. But I was just saying more generally in response to the question, not specifically pushing back at you, Nasir. Just broadly, I don't see AI as a panacea, as at least a single silver bullet that addresses this issue, and it might only make it worse, right? And this is exactly why we need to train the next generation of.
Yeah, so it's a technology problem, it's a business problem, it's a social problem, it's a human behavior problem, it's a legal policy problem. And I think what we need to do is come up, any solution will have to look at all these aspects, not simply just say AI and
At the risk of sounding optimistic, whenever I get to this slightly muddy part of the conversation, I always think about cigarette smoking. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't that long ago that cigarette smoking was cool. Doctors recommended it. There were commercials on TV. There was the Winston Cowboy. Like it seemed like it would never ever. And then there were a whole series of things that had to happen. Some were government, some were sociological, some were entertainment, some were informational. and now cigarette smoking is, dramatically decreased. So it isn't impossible that we're just going to have to be the victims of fake news for the remainder of time immemorial. That being said, Jeanette Martinez asks a question. She says, is there a code of ethics that programmers or developers are required to adhere to in order to maintain their license to operate, much like social workers are required to follow?
There isn't an industry-wide one. There are codes of ethics for organizations like ACM, the Association for Computer and Machinery, and so on, but there's no sort of there's no license that you need to get to program things, but there are sort of organizations that have codes of ethics.
It's interesting.
I
Yeah, go ahead.
I think this is a very interesting point, and maybe it would help us address that kind of holistic point of view. I mean, we are in 2020 and we still test code for functionality and not for actual delivery of the holistic operation, because code is not only supposed to work for functionality, they're supposed to work for humans on an ethical perspective, like Sadat just mentioned a while ago. And IBM has just started, I think, an initiative on that kind of ethical coding and building ethical debuggers, especially that would reduce algorithmic biases in codes. And I would encourage people, I mean, like what Nasser said, he's doing great work and building awareness in the community through many programs. We need to build more of these kind of programs within the research community to change the way we develop technology and to develop ethical codes or to develop, holistic code, I would say. Change the debugging, the compiler aspect. The way we compile codes is not supposed to be the same way.
And
we're getting near the end, and I want to ask a specific question for each one of you. There are 216 people on this call. Presumably they've all stayed, which congratulations to you for being that engaging and interesting. And so I'd like each of you to ask the audience, to suggest to the audience something they can do. I mean, this is a problem we all care about. We're all engaged. So if I get off this and I go, wow, that was intense and kind of hard and difficult, and now I have to go back to my day job, what's the thing that we can do as individuals within the tech community, within the education community, to begin to make a difference?
I can start with that, I think.
Please.
Because I do think students and people in the technical community have a lot more power sometimes than we think we do. The first thing is to recognize that that you have ethical responsibility with the things that you work on and you make. Like, especially if you're working in data science and AI, you can't necessarily count on, you can work with ethicists and sociologists, but you know what the code does, so you have to actually work with them and take some responsibility. And also, one of the few things we've seen actually move some of these big companies is they need talent, and they want the best talent. And it does hurt them when people see them as, contributing to making the world a worse place rather than a better place. And so, making the effort to try and make the things that you work on and the places that you work on, work on things that improve situations rather than harm them does matter.
Anyone else? Things we can do.
I'd like to add something from the pure user perspective. What you said, Rachel, is absolutely, I fully, I'm on your side. From the developer side, from the user perspective, it's really in a lot of cases about critical thinking and sometimes thinking before sharing something. And these are things that they don't have a technical component at all in that, but it's really about just trying to understand what is actually shared and spend this moment of thinking before we kind of, we amplify things as a whole, basically. So these are, I think these are things that everybody can do, should do, not limited to social platforms at all. I mean, that's a general trait as human in some way, that what we can work on to critically reflect. We will not always be right, and it's not about the point of that. We can be wrong. We are humans, right? We make errors. That's perfectly fine. But we can spend this little extra thinking, this little extra thought before amplifying things from our ends.
I think maybe I should tell users to send me $1 every time they share something. So maybe that'll stop people from sharing things and make me rich at the same time.
You mean like the jar in the office where when people curse, they have to put $1 in? That's very smart.
Or donate $1 to a good cause when you share or something like that. I don't know. But yeah, the sharing is, we are the ones who are spreading misinformation at the end of the day.
I like the idea of some kind of a toll road. Siddharth, do you have a?
No, I think I concur with everything that Rachel, Christina, and Nasir said. So I was also going to caution. We are all. I guess one thing that I would add to that is we should be aware that humans are extremely susceptible to bias, right? All manners of biases. So confirmation bias, very many other, and many of these. A lot of our susceptibility to bias is an evolutionary defense mechanism, but it's also playing out in really negative ways online. And I think we should be aware of our biases and question them every time you have an urge to share a news story on a social media platform.
Oh, the last word.
I would say we have too many stakeholders on the table, and let's bring it on the table. Let's bring it through the development life cycle of that AI and make it holistic. Crowdsource the problem, make it open source, put it out in the community, and start the initiative this way. I would recommend that we don't just wait until a giant tech company takes over the initiative or start solving the problem. As you said, Stephen, it's a community plus technology plus business problem. It's not just one perspective problem. So crowdsource it and let's just solve it in an open manner, try to evolve this.
So I have to confess, I began this conversation fearful that I would come away deeply depressed. That it would be that I don't feel that way at all. I think all of you bring technical skills and passion and understanding of the complexity and really thoughtful responses. Thank you for taking the time. Appreciate it very, very much. And I think our audience, if they were all here, they would clap as well. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.